Jaya Radha Gopinath Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe. Jaya Radha Gopinath Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajagacharya Ashtatara Satasata Shri Srimad His Divine Grace Abhay Chanaravinda Bhakti Vedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Shri Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan Ki Jai. Jai Nithai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Cheva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jaymudirayet Nashta Prayeshu Abhadreshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttama Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naishtaki Krishnaya Vasudevaya Devaki Nandanaya Cha Nanda Gopakumaraya Govindaya Namo Namaha. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 7. Further inquiries by Vidura, text number 11. Yata Jale Chandramasa Yata Jale Chandramasa Kampadistat Krito Guna Kampadistat Krito Ganaha Drishyate Sanapi Drashtur Drishyate Sanapi Drashtur Atmano Natmano Guna Atmano Natmano Gunaha Yata Jale Chandramasa Kampadistat Krito Gunaha Drishyate Sannapi Drashtur Atmano Natmano Gunaha Yata Jale Chandramasa Kampadistat Krito Gunaha Drishyate Sanapi Drashtur Atmano Natmano Gunaha Chatajale Chandramasa Kampadistat Krito Gunaha Drishyate Sanapi Drashtur Atmano Natmano Gunaha. Word for word. Yataha Yata as Jale in the water, Chandramasaha, of the moon, Kampa adihi, quivering, etc. Tatkritaha, done by the water. Gunaha, quality. Drishyate, it is so seen. Asanapi, without existence. Drashtuhu, of the seer. Atmanaha, of the self. Anatmanaha, of other than the self. Gunaha, quality. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace Abhayachan Aravinda Bhaktivedanta Swami Maharaj Srila Prabhupada Jagadguru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation. As the moon reflected on water appears to the seer to tremble due to being associated with the quality of the water, so the self associated with the matter appears to be qualified as matter. Purport. The Supreme Soul, the personality of Godhead, is compared to the moon in the sky, and the living entities are compared to the reflection of the moon on water. The moon in the sky is fixed and does not appear to quiver like the moon on the water. Actually, like the original moon in the sky, the moon reflected in the water should also not quiver. But because of being associated with water, the reflection appears to be quivering, although in actual fact the moon is fixed. The water moves, but the moon does not move. Similarly, the living entities appear to be tainted by material qualities like illusion, lamentation, and miseries, although in the pure soul such qualities are completely absent. The word pratiyate, which means apparently and not actually, like the experience of having one's head cut off in a dream, is significant here. The reflection of the moon on the water is the separated rays of the moon and not the actual moon. The separated parts and parcels of the Lord entangled in the water of material existence have the quivering quality, whereas the Lord is like the actual moon in the sky, which is not at all in touch with water. The light of the sun and moon reflected on matter makes the matter bright and praiseworthy. The living symptoms are compared to the light of the sun and the moon, illuminating material manifestations like trees and mountains. The reflection of the sun or moon is accepted as the real sun or moon by less intelligent men, and the pure monistic philosophy develops from these ideas. The reflection of the sun or moon is accepted as the real sun or moon by less intelligent men, and the pure monistic philosophy develops from these ideas. In fact, the light of the sun and the moon are actually different from the sun and the moon themselves, although they are always connected. The light of the moon spread throughout the sky appears to be impersonal, but the moon planet as it is personal, and the living entities on the moon planet are also personal. In the rays of the moon, different material entities appear to be comparatively more or less important. The light of the moon on the Taj Mahal appears to be more beautiful than the same light in the wilderness. Although the light of the moon is the same everywhere, due to being differently appreciated, it appears different. Similarly, the light of the Lord is equally distributed everywhere, but due to being differently received, it appears to be different. One should not therefore accept the reflection of the moon on the water as actual and misunderstand the whole situation through monistic philosophy. The quivering quality of the moon is also variable. When the water is standing still, there is no quivering. A more settled conditioned soul quivers less, but due to material connection, the quivering quality is more or less present everywhere. Translation again. As the moon reflected on water appears to the seer to tremble due to being associated with the quality of water, so the self associated with matter appears to be qualified as matter. Om Jnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupakada Mayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandhu Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanusute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Mancha kalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyeva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivas Adi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Mukham karoti vachalam langayate grimyat kripaha tamaham vande shigurun tirtharanam parvanandamadam Shri Chaitanya Ishwaram. Hare Krishna. Okay, so this purport's a very intricate purport. We'll go through the purport step by step, because this text helps us understand how is it that the living entity, which is of a spiritual nature, just as the Lord is of a spiritual nature, how is it that it's coming in contact with material modes of nature. This is text 5. The pure soul is pure consciousness and is never out of consciousness, either due to circumstance, time, situation, dreams, or other causes. How then does he become engaged in nescience? So Vidura talks about the Lord's interaction with material nature, and then Vidura inquires about the living entity's interaction with material nature. Because Krishna does say in Bhagavad Gita that aparayam tva itaste aparayam itaste what's it? Aparayas tvanyam prakriti me vidhi me para jiva bhuta mahabaho yayedam dharyate jagat. That these living entities are the ones that's holding up this material existence, and the living entities are of the para prakriti, the superior energy. Now, how is it that this superior energy, which is pure consciousness, Satchit Ananda, and being the spark in the fire, or in other words, being part and parcel of the Lord, and the Lord being full of knowledge, bliss, and eternality, and never affected by material nature, how is it that the living entity becomes affected? So here in the previous verse, Prabhupada talks about, or rather Maitreya Muni, he clarifies or he explains that the living entity is in distress regarding his self-identity. He has no factual background, like a man who dreams that he sees his head cut off. So it is like a dream. It is illusory situation or consciousness when the living entity becomes conditioned by material modes of nature. And in this verse, it's clarifying a bit more detail about what are the mechanics, or how does it work that the living entity becomes illusioned into thinking in this way. And the example given is that of the moon and the water. There are two things to take from this. Prabhupada emphasizes the whole purport on how the moon exists separate from the water, but the reflection of the water represents the jiva, whereas the original moon represents Krishna. And in this example, Prabhupada takes effort to mention that we should not come under the sway of monistic philosophy, because we understand that the rays of the moon and the moon are different, and they're the same at the same time. So the Achintya Bheda Bheda Tattva here we need to understand. And finally, Prabhupada talks a lot about the quivering nature of the soul, or in other words, the reflection of the moon on water. So there are three things here Prabhupada focuses on. In the we'll go through the purport step by step. The Supreme Soul, the personality of Godhead, is compared to the moon in the sky, and the living entities are compared to the reflection of the moon in the water. The moon in the sky is fixed and does not appear to quiver like the moon on the water. Actually, the original moon in the sky, the moon reflected on the water, should actually, like the original moon in the sky, the moon reflected in the water should also not quiver. But because of being associated with water, the reflection appears to be quivering, although in actual fact the moon is fixed. So here Prabhupada is explaining how the moon, when reflected on water, it should reflect the characteristics of the moon upon water. In other words, just as the moon does not change, the reflection on the water should not change or quiver or move. But unfortunately, being associated with water, the moon moves, or the reflection of the moon moves or quivers. Now, this is analogous to the fact that how the living entity comes in contact with material nature. Prabhupada says here, the water moves but the moon does not move. Similarly, the living entities appear to be tainted by material qualities like illusion, lamentation and miseries, although in the pure soul, such qualities are completely absent. The word pratiyate, which means apparently and not actually, is significant here. So, I'll go a step forward and then come back. The reflection of the moon on the water is the separated rays of the moon and not the actual moon. So here we are talking about, just as we emphasized a couple of purports ago, Prabhupada talks about the sun and how from the sun comes the light, the sun rays. And also from the sun comes the clouds and darkness. So the living entities, it looks like to them that the sun or the source, the absolute truth, Parabrahman, is covered by the clouds or covered by Maya or nescience. But actually, that's from the perspective of the living entity. If you had taken from the perspective of the Brahman, Parabrahman or Krishna, from his perspective, it is just simply a small section that is covered. He is not covered by it. So, the living entity, being this sun's rays, becomes covered by the clouds and the darkness that is manufactured by the sun. But the sun is not affected by it. Similarly, when this moon reflects its rays on water and the reflection appears on water, the moon is not affected by such rays coming in contact with the moving water. Unfortunately, the Mayavadis, due to a poor fund of knowledge, Prabhupada calls them the froggish philosophers, due to their dependence on an arrogance, or dependence on their own knowledge and arrogance and a pride in such knowledge, they consider that just as the moon is there and the moon is reflected on water, that we are also the Supreme Brahman, and we have forgotten because we've come in contact with water or we've come in contact with Maya. So therefore, the Brahman also comes under transformational control or the illusion of Maya. So therefore we call them Mayavadis, because they are propounding this philosophy of how the illusory energy is more powerful than the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So here two things. One is that the moon is there. The reflection of the moon here in this analogy is the living entities, and how both the moon and the living entities, or the reflection, are meant to be steady or unaffected by the water. Just because the water exists doesn't mean the moon is affected by it. Rather, it's very interesting in the other way. If you think about it, it is due to the moon that there are tides. It is due to the moon that there are tides. The water comes in or water goes out. So in the same way, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is not affected or contaminated by material energy. But even though he may come in contact with material energy, he is not affected by it. Just like the king comes, creates the rules of the government, enters the prison house, but he is never affected by the rules or the laws of the prison house. He can walk in and he can walk out. So similarly, the Lord is unaffected in that way. So the living entities, being part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, should also have that quality, at least to a certain degree, that they should also, in pure consciousness, be unaffected by material modes of nature. But it is the characteristic or the nature of the living entity that being marginal, coming in contact with material nature, will come under the clutches of material nature. In other words, the living entity will become conditioned. Krishna says in Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna that many, many births you and I have taken. I remember them all, but you do not, O Arjuna. So we can understand from there that when the living entity comes in contact with material nature, unless blessed or given certain potency of the Lord, they are unable to remember the past life activity. Which means that being in contact with material nature covers the living entity's understanding, consciousness, Asat, Achit and Nirananda. Now in the case of pure devotees of the Lord arranges the situation so that the living entities can be able to be engaged in the Lord's service. The example is given of the coconut and the dried coconut. So they both appear to be same, but the fresh coconut, the flesh or the pulp of the coconut is attached to the shell. So that's equivalent to that of a conditioned soul. Whereas when one is a pure soul or unconditioned by material nature, it is like that of a coconut with a dry pulp. When sometimes you shake a coconut, you'll see the pulp, because it's become so dry, the pulp rattles inside the coconut shell. So the living entity, when in pure consciousness, like in the case of Sri Arjuna, the Pandavas, Prahlad Maharaj and all the other great souls that are Mahajans, that are all surrendered to the Lord's lotus feet, apparently they have a material body, but they are not conditioned by that material body. They are not conditioned by material nature. Just as the pulp inside the coconut is, when it's dry, it rattles. Similarly, it appears that the pulp is surrounded by the coconut, but the pulp is not attached to the shell. In other words, this living entity is not affected by material nature in the pure state of consciousness. How much he remembers, that's up to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Just as we see examples of Bharat Maharaj, how he is able to remember his two previous lives. So Chitraketu Maharaj, how he is able to remember his previous life. Even Narad Muni is able to, when he explains to Vyasadeva about his life, explains to Yudhishthira Maharaj about his life before that life. So when he was a Gandharva, and after that Narad a boy as a son of a maidservant Kalavati, and then he became Narad Muni in this, or at that particular point in time when he became a son of Lord Brahma. So the Lord gives the potency to remember to the living entities. But to the degree of the surrender of the living entities, to that degree the Lord empowers. Because as mentioned here, that when the living entity becomes empowered by the Lord with the potencies of the Lord, then what happens is that they also take on the qualities of the Lord, being less affected by material modes of nature. But those who don't surrender to the Lord, although such facilities there, the Lord being impartial, ready to give privilege in material existence, to be able to exist in the material world but not be affected by it, He gives it according to one's surrender. So when one surrenders to the Lord, then one gets that potency to be able to become like the pure devotee, completely detached from material existence, although existing within the material world. Therefore it says, Vaishnavera Kriya Mudra Na Vijnaya Bujhoy. That is very difficult to recognize a pure devotee, because the activities from an external platform seems the same, but internally it's of a different nature, different consciousness. Like I always remember this one in 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, when Narad Muni is glorifying his own disciple Prahlad Maharaj to Yudhishthira Maharaj. He tells Yudhishthira Maharaj that actually Prahlad Maharaj was so absorbed in the Lord that he did not even care for any of the functions of the body. Krishna carried out the functions for Prahlad Maharaj. In other words, eating, sleeping, evacuating, speaking, interacting with the material world, all of these things were not on Prahlad Maharaj's mind. In fact, Prahlad Maharaj was simply absorbed in the Lord's qualities, characteristics, glories. All of the functions of the body it's mentioned, Krishna personally made sure it happened. It is not that Prahlad Maharaj had to do anything. So in the same way, we may see Prahlad Maharaj doing these activities, And we may, he's just another living entity, like one of us. He's performing evacuation functions, we're also doing it as well. He's eating, we're eating. He's sleeping, we're sleeping. It seems the same from an external platform. But when you have a look at it from the eyes of Shastra, Prahlad Maharaj's consciousness was completely absorbed in the lotus feet of the Lord. So in that way, you can see how Prabhupada says the moon is stationary and the moon's reflection on the water should also be stationary. But because of association with the water which moves and quivers, the reflection of the moon also changes or quivers or moves around. Now on this next section of the purport, Prabhupada emphasizes, actually coming back to this one, like Prabhupada says here, the word pratiyate, which means apparently and not actually, like the experience of one's head cut off in a dream, it's very similar to how we explain the how the soul should not be affected by material existence. Prabhupada gives this example when we hear the verse. Oh, it's not coming to me. Such a common verse. You know, not affected by coming and going of winter and summer seasons. Matra spashastu kauntaya sitoshna sukha dukkada agama payano nityas tamstatikshasva bharata. There Prabhupada gives the example of how the living entity, due to misidentifying with the body, suffers. And the example given is that of a car. When the living entity is driving in a car and crashes the car, then for the living entity who's crashed the car, they feel like that, they've crashed, that their life is finished. But for a third person observer, they understand that this living entity and this car are two totally different things. And the living entity lamenting over the car's destruction thinks that also feels the pain of the car. But the third person sees that actually there's no pain at all. The living entity and the car are two totally different things. So in the same way, the living entity in the body has misidentified with the body. So anything that happens to the body, the living entity thinks it's happening to himself or herself. And that is illusion or maya. And that's explained as a mirage, that the living entity thinks it's like that, but it's not actually like that. I was listening recently to my spiritual master, and he was explaining how Prahlad Maharaj mentions that the happiness and distress that one experiences, or the enjoyment one experiences by using the senses in any form of life is the same. The same sense of happiness that we experience by using the senses in the human body is the same quality or the same nature that of a pig or a hog. And he gave an example. And he mentioned that just say, for example, he was giving a class and he was saying after this class there's going to be prasadam distributed. So imagine you had 3 different types of plates. One made of tin, one made of paper, and another one made of gold encrusted with diamonds. Now if you serve the prasadam, the same prasadam in all 3, and you eat the prasadam from each of the plates, now it would be quite foolish of you to consider that the prasadam tastes better on the golden diamond encrusted plate compared to the paper plate. No, the prasadam stays the same. So when the senses come in contact with the sense objects in any form of life, that contact or happiness is, or I guess that it's not happiness, but so-called happiness, that experience is the same in any form of life. And what does that teach you? It is simply within the mind. It is just simply within the mind. When we think that, that person or that living entity is enjoying better than me, actually when we go to that point or situation of life, we will understand that actually we're not enjoying. It is just simply a mental concoction. So the fact we think that we'll enjoy food better on a gold diamond encrusted plate compared to a paper plate, it's just a mental concoction that because this plate looks like this, it will taste better, and the plate looks like that, it won't taste better. So it's just simply a mental concoction. So the illusory energy of the Lord plays on such a subtle platform, on the platform of intelligence and the mind. So here Prabhupada says that act apparently or not actually, that is the experience of the soul. Because the point here is that the living entity is also like the Lord, separated from material existence. But we have chosen to become conditioned, trying to enjoy the senses or trying to enjoy separately from the Lord. But the Mayavadi philosophers, then they will take this a step further or in the wrong direction. Where does Prabhupada say this? The light of the moon spread out the sky appears to be impersonal, but the moon planet as it is personal, and the living entities on the moon planet are also personal. In the rays of the moon, different material entities appear to be comparatively more or less important. Yeah. Similarly, light of the Lord is equally distributed everywhere, but due to being differently received, it appears to be different. One should not therefore accept the reflection of the moon on the water as actual and misunderstand the whole situation through monistic philosophy. So actually Prabhupada is taking this a step further. The monistic philosophy won't have, in one sense, will take the moon and the reflection of the moon and butcher the whole analogy and say that actually the moon reflected on water is actually Brahman being affected by Maya, and then Maya somehow or other is superior to Brahman, and that Brahman should somehow or other forget this and go back to its original position. That's one way. Another way, Prabhupada is saying that the monistic philosophy will interpret or twist this analogy is that the light of the moon is spread throughout the sky appears to be impersonal, but the moon planet is personal. So they'll say that the quality of the moon, because the light of the moon has spread throughout the universe and reflected on the water, it means that the moon is present in the water as well. They won't take the other aspect of it. But Prabhupada says that actually if you're going to say that the light is all pervasive and impersonal and throughout the universe, and it reflects in the water, and there are many moons reflected in the water, and that's the moon itself in the water, that because they talk about Brahman, what is that aphorism? That Tattvamasi. So they're understanding that they are also Brahman. The reflection of the moon or the individual living entity is also Brahman. It comes from Brahman and it should merge back in Brahman. So the light of the moon is reflected on the water, is non-different from the moon, and that being impersonal, that the moon in the water and the moon in the sky are the same. They're the same thing. But the analogy is not like that. The analogy is saying that the moon is separate from that of the moon reflected in water. But the moon and the reflection of the moon on the water are the same in the sense that they are both reflected of the same qualities, not quantity. So that's the understanding. So then Prabhupada then takes a step. Okay, so then if you're going to say that the reflection of the moon is everywhere, it's impersonal, actually the rays of the moon is the impersonal aspect, but the moon itself is personal and the living entities within the moon are personal. And then Prabhupada goes a step further and says, if you want to even take the fact that the light of the moon spreads throughout the sky, then in the rays also there's differentiation of variety. Because when the moon's rays hit on Taj Mahal, it becomes brilliant, it becomes very nice. But when that same rays gets hit in the wilderness, in the forest, no one appreciates it. It's not that great. So even there's variety, there is difference there. So if you take that aspect of just the impersonal thing, even in the analogy it doesn't hold. There's differentiation there. It's not equivalent to the moon itself. So Prabhupada again mentions that we should not fall sway unto the monistic philosophy. And then finally here Prabhupada's giving the point, the quivering quality of the moon is also a variable. When the moon is standing still, there is no quivering. A more settled conditioned soul quivers less. Sorry, I misread that. The quivering quality of the moon is also a variable. When the water is standing still, then there is no quivering. A more settled conditioned soul quivers less, but due to material connection, the quivering quality is more or less present everywhere. So, Prabhupada's mentioning that as long as we exist in or in the material cosmos, in the material world, there's going to be some level of quivering, more or less. There's going to be some materialistic quality there. And as I was explaining, that for the devotee, it appears that they are also part of this quivering or this material quality, being the activity being similar to what other living entities do. But when the water is standing still, there is no quivering. When the living entity revives his original dormant Krishna consciousness, then one becomes more settled and quivers less, being unaffected by material nature. Now, that's the full purport. There was one more here that I needed to focus on. Okay, so here, the crux or the point Prabhupada was mentioning regarding the reflection of the moon or the energy of the moon. Prabhupada says the reflection of the sun or moon is accepted as the real sun or moon by less intelligent men, and the pure monistic philosophy develops from these false ideas, or from these ideas. Yeah, so the idea of how this whole philosophy of Mayavad, if you actually read carefully, and if you read how Prabhupada explains the original reason why the living entity left the material world and is engaged in material existence, you can understand the whole Mayavadi philosophy is based, whole Karma Kanda philosophy, Jnana Kanda, all of these understandings, the Jnanis, the Yogis and the Karmis, their whole operation or the core crux of their understanding or existence is based on this envy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. That they want to become the enjoyer rather than becoming the enjoyed. So based on that one premise, then all of these philosophies propounded by such persons other than the bhaktas then becomes a big mess. Because here Prabhupada is saying that the reflection of the sun or moon is accepted by real sun or moon by less intelligent men, and the pure monistic philosophy develops from these ideas. So they consider only one aspect. They're not able to see the full spectrum. They simply see the reflection of the sun or the reflection of the moon on the water, and that's it. They're not able to understand the in-depth details of how the moon itself is separate and the rays of the moon are separate. They're not equivalent. But, as Prabhupada says here, that the less intelligent men will not be able to see that. And it's very nice that in devotional service we're able to pick that up immediately. That's the first step of devotional service, to understand the self. And Prabhupada has given so much in that the foundation of the Bhagavad Gita, or the foundation of spiritual understanding of how we're not the body but the soul. And Prabhupada has given us so much to be able to understand that one point, that if we understand that one point, we can also understand how other living entities following the other paths of transcendental realization, they are just simply running around in circles for many, many lifetimes. Whereas the bhaktas or the devotees can immediately understand Krishna and just engage in devotional service, that's it. Even without understanding Krishna in one sense. As we were reading in Uddhava Gita, Krishna is saying those who understand him or don't understand him, but engage in his devotional service, still he protects them. So in the same way, when we come into devotional service, we practice devotional service under the guidance of the devotee, Krishna automatically gives us mercy. We just have to simply continue, and Krishna will gradually reveal within the heart the appropriate or the original nature of the living entity, and to understand our position in relationship with him. And gradually we'll just perform more and more devotional service to the extent that material nature doesn't even matter to us. It is just simply an instrument or energy to be used in Krishna's service again. But Maya is so powerful that these monistic tendencies, these karmic tendencies, jnana tendencies, they're all deep within the heart. And they will pop up once in a while. And they will become great impediments or obstacles in our path of devotional service. So therefore we continually read Srimad Bhagavatam, Shravanam, Kirtanam, Vishnu Smaranam, practicing devotional service in these 9 ways, and gradually and regularly we will understand how the Supreme Personality of Godhead is pleased with our devotional service, and how we should just continue in devotional service. Because it appears devotional service is very simple. Radheshyam Prabhu was mentioning in one class that when he went to preach in some university with the youth, one of the youth came towards him and told him, so this chanting of Hare Krishna mantra, is that the only process? And Radheshyam Prabhu says, yeah, it's a very simple process. You just simply chant Hare Krishna. And this young boy was asking him, oh, so just chanting, there's no anything else? He said, no, chanting is enough. You just simply perform chanting and you'll attain the result. It's a very simple method. Oh, so there's nothing else? There's nothing else to do? I think this chanting is just too simple. There must be something else there. So Radheshyam Prabhu was saying that unfortunately our consciousness is like that. We've complicated it too much that when we've given something simple to perform, that we think that there should be something more. Something extra. It just seems too simple. It just seems too trivial, too easy. It appears that way, but it's not. That's why the Mayavadis then mention that bhakti is just for the sentimental. But they won't perform bhakti because they understand it's not a simple process in the sense that it is not something that anybody and everybody can do. It's only those who are dedicated to giving up material existence, only they can perform bhakti. The Mayavadis can't because they have not dedicated their lives to giving up material existence. So therefore they'll stand in the corners, in the sideline, and in the peripherals they will criticize the devotees for being sentimental and simple. But actually the devotees are performing the greatest activity. That's why when we read Chaitanya Charitamrita, there in the Vijaya Lakshmi or the Hera Panchami pastimes, there Shri Srivas Thakur tells Swarup Damodar and Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu that just see the opulence of my Lakshmi Devi. Just see how opulent she is. But just see your gopis of Vrindavan. They're just simply engaged in churning butter, and there's a few twigs and leaves there. What glory is there in Vrindavan? And Swarup Damodar sets him straight and mentions the glories of Sri Vrindavan Dham. How the dust of Vrindavan are like jewels, how every walk is like a dance, every word is a song, and how the gopis are like millions of goddess of fortunes serving Krishna there. And the trees there, they're all Kalpavriksha trees, willing to yield to the desires of the living entities there. So you can understand that for the residents of Vrindavan, although they have so much opulence, they care nothing, they don't care a fig for using that opulence for themselves. They're simply engaged in wanting to engage in Krishna's service. Because the very opulences that we're running after in this material world, they're considered to be nothing or insignificant for the devotees who are running after Krishna's lotus feet. So you can understand there that all the pastimes of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, they appear, especially Vrindavan pastimes, they're the topmost, but they appear to be the most simple, so-called unsophisticated. But actually they're considered to be the topmost, the crux, the jewel of devotional service or of relation with the Lord. So this complicated nature of the living entity needs to be rectified, and that we can do by chanting Hare Krishna regularly and following the four regulative principles and engaging in devotional service in the association of devotees. And gradually, by this process of surrender, when we gradually become more and more attached and more fixed in the service of the Lord, then we can go even more deeper and understand when we perform devotional service, how much are we absorbed in the Lord's name, fame, form, qualities and pastimes. Or in between service, how much are we able to remember the Lord's lotus feet. Like for example, sometimes we have bad dreams or nightmares, and when we wake up, we may be fortunate enough to remember the Lord's lotus name, the Lord's names. But when we're in that difficult situation, do we analyze if we were able to remember the Lord during that circumstance? During the so-called nightmare, were we able to remember the Lord? Were we able to remember His qualities, name, form? Were we able to take shelter of the Lord? So does that mean at the end of life we'll be also in such a difficult situation, we'll be able to remember the Lord? So we can gradually so-called boil the milk or go deeper in our devotional service by understanding how much Krishna conscious we are and performing devotional service more and more, and trying to emphasize or concentrate on the Lord's form, because the Lord focuses on so much in Gita. Manmana bhava mad bhakto. Just focus your mind upon me. Ananya chetasa, ananya chetasa. I can't remember the third word. Anyway, the translation there is the mention that Krishna says that the pure devotees being absorbed in their consciousness being absorbed in Him, Nitya Yuktasya Yogina, such yogis who are always absorbed in Him, Tasya Ham Sulabham Partha, Nitya Yuktasya Yogina. For them the path of going back to Godhead is very easy. Tasyaham sulabham partha, very easy to perform. So sulabham, labham, to obtain. Sulabham means very easy to obtain that destination. So for the devotees, that's the consciousness, or that's the understanding, to go deeper and deeper. But at the same time, we understand that our devotional service is maintained by serving the Yuga Avatar, serving Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the Sankirtan Dharma. And Mahaprabhu was asked, Yare dekata hai kaha Krishna Upadesh. So if you want to fast track your devotional service, if you just simply engage in hearing, chanting of Krishna, following the four regulative principles, following the orders of the spiritual master, taking association, and that means also going out and preaching Krishna consciousness, you're covered. You don't have to struggle so hard anywhere. If you just simply perform these activities again and again and again with more and more conviction and determination, the Lord will naturally give His mercy, and one will be able to be freed of material existence, and the so-called water of material existence will become still. There will be no quivering. And then we will be able to understand one's nature or connection with the Lord. So just to wrap up, how is it that the living entity comes in, how does it the living entity, which is pure in consciousness, identifies with nescience? It is because of misidentification with material nature. That's it. It is due to a wrong understanding of one's identity. Just as Maitreya Muni is mentioning here in two examples. One imagines in his dream the head being cut off, or just as the moon is reflected on the water, but the reflection of the moon shakes. Similarly, the living entity becoming in contact with material nature, due to that contact with material nature and accepting that illusion, it is due to that misidentification of being of thinking themselves the body and not the soul. That is how the pure consciousness becomes covered by the inferior energy, and one considers oneself to be in nescience. And in the next verse, in tomorrow's verse, Maitreya Muni will mention that how this misconception can be diminished gradually by the mercy of the Lord through the process of devotional service in the mode of detachment. So that's the reason why the living entity considers himself to be the body and suffers in nescience, and the process or the solution to get out of such misidentification is devotional service of the Lord. So these are the two things. And again, wrapping up this purport, Prabhupada's talking about the moon reflected on the water, how the moon represents the Supreme Lord, and the rays of the moon being reflected on the water, reflecting the moon as it departs and parcels, how that the reflection of the moon changes on the water because of the water's nature of being trembling or being unsteady, but the moon doesn't get affected by it. And also the living entity shouldn't be affected by it, but because of association with the water or association with Maya, they're becoming affected, and that they've come under nescience. Okay, so it's past 8:45. Any question? We can... Yeah, so here Prabhupada mentions in that purport, I didn't mention this sequentially. It would make sense as you read in the purport. Prabhupada says here that the light in the sun and the moon is reflected on water, makes the matter bright and praiseworthy. So the light of the moon reflecting on water makes the matter bright and praiseworthy. Prabhupada he sort of draws the similarity there, how the sun and moon and the light emanating from the sun and the moon from the Lord comes the consciousness, comes the energy, so to speak. So, where is it? The living entities are compared to the light of the sun and the moon. So that's the energy coming from the sun and the moon, illuminating material manifestations like trees and mountains. The reflection of the moon or sun is accepted by the real sun or moon by less intelligent men, and the pure monistic philosophy develops from these ideas. The light of the moon spread throughout the sky appears to be impersonal, but the moon planet is personal, and the living entities on the moon planet are also personal. So their understanding is that you have the moon, you have the energy of the moon. They make both of them equivalent or the same. That the moon and the rays of the moon are the same. Just like how we say the sun and the sun's rays are the same. When we see a sunny room, then we see that the sun, we say, oh, the sun is here. But the sun is not really here. Right? For the Mayavadis, their understanding is that the moon exists, and that's the source of all the energies, and from the moon, the energies have emanated from that moon, and those energies are equivalent to the moon. That's their understanding. And Prabhupada says it's due to less intelligence. The reflection of the sun or moon is accepted as the real sun or moon. So it appears that the sun or moon is there, but it's not actually the sun or moon is there. It's the energy of the sun or moon that's been reflected there. But because they don't want to accept the fact that there's the Brahman and his energy, as soon as they accept that fact, then their monistic philosophy becomes void. Right? Because everything is Brahman for them. Sarvam Kalvedam Brahman. Right? But as soon as they accept that there's energy of this that's separate from Brahman, as soon as they accept that, it becomes void. Right? So then their understanding of how the living entity becomes, or Brahman becomes covered by material existence, is that the moon exists there and the energy exists in the water, and the moon also exists in the water. It's just an illusory thing to think that the moon is affected by the water. But for them, they're saying, no, actually the moon becomes affected by water. And that moon being affected by water, the reflection is equivalent to the moon that's outside. Because if they acknowledge that they're different, then for them immediately their whole philosophy of how Brahman is supreme and how Brahman doesn't come under transformation, and how Brahman, we are also Brahman, all of that falls apart. Because as soon as they say that what they don't understand is, as soon as they say that the moon becomes affected, immediately Brahman is becoming transformed, and it destroys their philosophy. So they say that actually the moon is there and the moon is there. They both exist. So they misidentify the energy with the Lord, energy with the Lord, or the rays with the moon, conveniently for their sake of their philosophy. So yeah, Prabhupada saying here it's because of that. Reflection of the sun and moon is accepted as the real sun or moon by less intelligent men. Because they don't see the other aspect. Like we've become trained in devotional service so much that we see Achintya Beda Beda Tattva. We see the Lord's sun and the rays are two different. Before I came to devotional service, when I was following, I happened to go to one class of one particular school of thought. And there the Swamiji was explaining how within a dream, when you sit on the rock in the dream, actually the rock doesn't exist, and you don't, it appears to exist but it doesn't exist. Within the dream it doesn't. But he, with so much jugglery, he was explaining, I lost him. He was talking about, it exists but it doesn't exist. You know? And so they explain that within the dream, the rock it looks like it's existing but it doesn't exist because the whole thing's a dream. And through these word jugglery, explaining so many different things about how the living entity is Brahman, but due to illusion, the living entity is in material existence. But that's just simply part of his dream. He's chosen to be in material existence. It's part of the lila, part of the activities. That although he calls so-called suffering and enjoyments going, actually he's not affected by it. He's not really affected by it. It's just some illusory concept that we're enjoying and happy, or we're distressed. And actually we're not affected by it, we are Brahman. So that idea or twisting is there. Something that you can simply observe and see, that the living entity in the dream is suffering or enjoying. The fact that the living entity suffers and enjoys means that there's something wrong with the whole existence there of the living entity is Ananda. full of bliss. So word jugglery messes it all up. So in the example of the sun and the rays, then they'll say that the rays of the sun or the spark or the fire is the same as the fire. They'll equate them both. And they'll do it through so much philosophical word jugglery. But you see how Prabhupada's given simply. There's fire and there's spark. Immediately you can understand fire is bigger in quantity, spark is inferior in quantity. Quality same, quantity different. Living entity is like this, Supreme Lord is like this. Simple, understood. But it won't sit well with the Mayavadis because they want to enjoy. So then they'll misinterpret it in this way, that the spark and the fire are the same. Like that. So in that way, that's how they understand the energy and the sun's rays or the moon's ray and the moon to be the same. They don't see the quantitative difference. They only see the qualitative sameness. They make the quantitative difference as illusory. That you've just forgotten, but actually you're Brahman. You've just forgotten, but actually you're full in this. And when you gradually become self-realized, then you'll become in full in quantity again. It's just illusion that you've forgotten, but actually you can come to the full quantitative method, quantitative capacity as the Brahman. So they don't listen to that part. They don't listen to the Beda platform, the Abeda platform, the sameness, like that. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Okay, we'll finish here. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai. Shri Radha Gopinath Bhagavan ki jai. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Jai Nitai Gaur Premanande.